All right, welcome. Thank you guys for joining us. My name's Uptin Saiidi. I'm with CNBC. I cover a lot of technology, and I'm based here in Hong Kong. We'll have each of the panelists give us a little introduction beyond what was just said and hear a little bit about what they're doing within the self-driving space. Kim-Mai?
Hi, my name is Kim-Mai Cutler. I'm with Initialized Capital, which is a San Francisco-based early-stage venture firm. It was founded by a couple of former Y Combinator partners, and in the course of the last couple of years, we've invested in Cruise, which was sold to General Motors for $1 billion and is now testing a lot of their self-driving car technology in San Francisco and in the Bay Area and heavily in urban environments. We're also investors in RideCell, which you may not have heard about, but actually it is powering a lot of rideshare networks for OEMs, automakers, campuses, and different other communities or networks, because there's a lot of reasons why cities and different communities wouldn't necessarily want to cede ride-sharing or ride-hailing to just Uber and Lyft. And then we're also investors in Voyage Auto, which was started by the former Vice President of Engineering at Udacity, Oliver Cameron, spun out of Udacity and the self-driving car course there. And they are actually testing autonomous vehicles in retirement communities in the United States.
Great. Laszlo?
My name is Laszlo Kishonti. I'm the CEO and founder of AImotive. AImotive is a self-driving car software company. This is my second company. My first company was a chip technology service company working with large chip companies like NVIDIA, Samsung, Intel, and others. This is important because Samsung and NVIDIA became investors also in my second company. And what's the differentiator of AImotive to other self-driving car companies is that we want to save costs, and instead of using very expensive LiDAR-based technology, the Waymo cars and the other competing cars cost about $200,000. Our cars cost about $50,000 because our main focus is based on vision, because the whole traffic system is based on visual clues, traffic signs, lane markings, turn indicators, all the other objects around you are basically visual, and this is how human drivers process the information. So basically we want to substitute the human driver by replicating the functions, what you do with your eyes and your brain. And we are not that small anymore. We are now 200 people. We have offices in Asia, Europe, and North America as well. And this is one of the things we are proud of, that we test the cars already on the 3 continents, not just in very small geo-fenced environments like many others do.
Great. So we're going to get a little interactive and use the Slido app. So if you guys can go into Slido, I have an active poll. In 2030, will there still be human drivers? I want to know what you guys think. So that's 12 years away. Yes or no? We'll see what the response is in about 10 minutes. Also, submit your questions. We'll try and get them up on the stage. And we already got a vote. So what are the biggest obstacles right now to really seeing self-driving cars become sort of ubiquitous?
Yes, so cost is one issue. As I mentioned, we, for example, use cameras, and the cameras itself are very cheap. One camera costs $15, but the processing of the sensor data is based on GPUs at the moment. GPUs were designed for processing graphics in PlayStation and games. And one of our major projects within the company is to design better chips, which we will produce with our chip partners to make this computing more accessible for the consumers and the cars. Because I think that this is, if we can solve this problem, obviously AI and all this recognition will go to other markets as well. Second, regulation is not clear. Most of the governments around the world hasn't showed a clear roadmap what will happen. In the United States, for example, every state have different regulations for self-driving cars. This makes the life of self-driving car companies and anyone related to this very complicated. So we expect that sooner or later there should be some kind of, at least a national regulation in the US and European Union-wide regulation in Europe. China and Japan is obviously also important.
Kim-Mai, there's a big entire ecosystem when you talk about self-driving cars that goes far beyond companies that are directly developing and researching the actual vehicle or the technology behind the vehicle. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so even though we've invested in 2 companies that were directly building autonomous vehicles, there's a whole kind of universe beyond that. There's a lot of things that are going to be fundamentally changing about cities and about the way that we live and the infrastructure that supports autonomous vehicles outside of the cars themselves. So, for example, in a lot of American cities, the city governments and municipal governments are heavily dependent on like fare and fee revenue, on parking ticket revenue. There's a lot of city and transit agency officials that I've talked to over the years that would love to have a solution that replaces the parking revenue. They would love to see, say, dynamic curbside pricing where if you're doing drop off and pickup of Uber or Lyft passengers, or if people are getting orders or dropping off goods, that there's some type of pricing of that to replace the foregone parking revenue. There's also the physical landscape of the cities themselves. When you think about traditional kind of sprawl suburban style development in a given neighborhood, something like 30% of the footprint in the land area might be covered by space that is specifically devoted to cars. And so if you start thinking about ways that you can configure space differently, you can actually get a much higher level of density into an existing square mile or acre. And so there are also opportunities to kind of in the real estate world that aren't necessarily going to be taken on by the cities or metropolitan governments themselves, but maybe like a real estate partner that are going to rethink design of physical space around AVs.
Great. And in terms of governments, you're based in the U.S. A lot of your portfolios are in the U.S. Is the U.S. government friend or foe in terms of development of self-driving cars?
I think that's a very complicated question because there are many different levels and layers of government. So you could start at the hyper-local or the municipal level. Is a city, to what extent does a city control that vis-a-vis the state, for example? So if you look at different transportation technologies over the last 10 years, the reason that Uber and Lyft got ahead very quickly was because it was mostly controlled at the state level in the state of California versus looking at bike sharing or scooters, which is more regulated at the city level. So you have to think about what's the regulatory body that convenes and manages all of this? And then, at the federal level, given what is happening to American government more generally, where power is kind of bleeding towards the edges and cities are having to lead the way, to what extent is the federal government actually controlling and convening all these different stakeholders to agree on a specific set of standards? So it's kind of hard to answer that question because we have a very federated system.
It doesn't sound like it's very much of a friend.
Yeah.
On any of the levels, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's different there's a reason that certain companies have chosen flat suburban jurisdictions versus heavy urban jurisdictions versus, say, private land and private development where you can interact with a single partner and then, have a much more manageable kind of policy environment in which to test cars.
Laszlo, in looking at the broader scale and ecosystem of self-driving cars, where are the opportunities for startups? Where would you say is a sector or a sort of space that there's just not enough innovation happening, or a space that needs to catch up to sort of the rest of the startups that you're seeing?
So 3 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, there were a lot of markets that were new, but now we have like 100 sensor startups, at least 60 self-driving car startups. So the competition is much more aggressive this time, but I think that for data management, because there is a lot of data coming out from these cars, and to handle the data, especially to handle the data securely, there are still interesting issues which are not solved yet. That's, I think data is the most important part, and I think it will be not just a convenience feature that, for example, the cars will need to be able to update the software, because just imagine what would happen if there would be, in 2030, there would be 10-year-old self-driving cars without updates. So I think governments will use similar setups like within the commercial aviation, where we borrow a lot of ideas from. Commercial aviation is much more safe than road traffic, and one of the reasons for that is that all the pilots are trained on simulators, and they are very good at what they are doing. We do the same, for example, and many other companies do the same with the self-driving algorithms to be tested first on the simulators. The second is the black box. So we record everything. Some governments, like Germany, already announced that all self-driving cars should have a black box, similarly to airplanes. And thirdly, the government in the aviation industry, FAA, can stop faulty aircraft. But if you have 100 million self-driving cars out there, how do you stop them? That's not possible. That's why I expect that they will require these secure updates. It needs to be secure, because just think about if someone can hack into a car, that could be weaponized quite easily.
Yeah. Kim-Mai, same question. I mean, as an investor, what areas are you seeing that are oversaturated, and what areas do you think there's opportunities for startups to really scale and make it?
So we're a very early stage firm. So we tend to invest in companies just right when the founder. So we invested in Voyage, for example, when Oliver was leaving Udacity, and so we tend to be opportunistic around, the founder or the talent itself. We're not really, a sector-specific firm that looks at different sectors and decides like we're going to invest in this versus that. We're mostly talent-based, and talent plus the market opportunity. So it's hard for me to answer that question.
Fair. Are there any questions from the audience that we can pull up on the screen? While we get that up, maybe we can show the poll. Oh, here we go. In a future model with self-driving cars all over the road, who becomes accountable for road accidents and fatalities, in your opinion? Anyone want to take that?
So we just discussed this question. This is a very interesting question, but to be honest, we already have cars on the road, and you don't read every day in the papers or articles that automotive engineers go to jail every week, because what's the process is that the authorities, of course, will check after an accident how it could happen, how it happened, but the process of development needs to be standardized and checked. So if a company does everything correctly and all the tests show that the car, hardware-wise, software-wise, was perfectly tested before we sold it to the consumer or a ride-hailing company or whatever, then it is the faulty part producing company will be still responsible, but no one will go to the jail. So that's the real question. If no one knows at the moment what could happen, like the same thing with tires. If you put a tire on your car and the tire goes wrong, then you can easily die. But the tire makers account all these past accidents, and there will be new ones, so they try to test the tires. Tire is at least as important as self-driving car software to save your life or not to cause any accidents. And I think it's the testing methodology which will be checked out with each company who had accidents. Like in the Uber's case, the most important problem was not that they had a faulty software, that was a funnily faulty software, but that a lady without very high-end test driver education went alone with the car. No one was beside her in a prototype car. That was the problem.
I want to ask, one of the reasons I ask so much about government is because, unlike a lot of things in technology that can be driven in scale by demand from consumer, when you talk about driving, obviously you need a lot of government support and regulation, right? So what markets are we gonna see sort of lead the way in the next 5 years? Is it the US? Is it China? Is it Europe? Where do you really see this leading? Like, which country do you see leading the way in this? Either of you?
I think the companies and then the countries themselves have different approaches. In the case of the US, there's a question there about infrastructure investment and what needs to happen from a governmental level. In the US, an American entrepreneur is going to make the decision that we can't wait for the infrastructure. We have to design a self-contained system that kind of manages itself. Whereas in a more centralized environment where the government can more rapidly deploy smart streetlights, sensors and road sensors that kind of interact with the vehicles themselves, there might be more flexibility to design systems that integrate both. I think it's something else that's kind of interesting is the cultural tastes of different consumers. So, for example, Baidu had its developer conference last week in Beijing. The main vehicle that they unveiled was a bus. I would have a very hard time as an American believing that an American company doing that when their first product would be a bus, and that's just a function of the way that our mode of transportation, our mode of urban design is much more individualistic and much more sprawl-centric. And so, the products that are coming out of American companies are, they're standard. They're kind of like 5-seater cars, basically. Whereas in Europe and East Asia, you're going to see like medium format or large format self-driving and autonomous vehicles.
So does that mean that in talking about centralized government, does that mean Dubai or a Singapore or a Finland is going to sort of be the first? Because it's so easy relative to other markets for them to sort of scale.
I don't know about be the first. They're just going to have a different. They're going to have a different technological approach and a different way that a different way that the technology is going to be baked into the urban environment. Whereas founders that I talk to in the U.S., they're like, we can't wait for smart cities or smart sensors. We have to do it ourselves. Yeah.
Laszlo, what big markets? We just have a couple minutes, but what market is going to lead the way?
So, obviously, where these very expensive cars with the LiDAR setups with cost of $200,000 are will be introduced first, is where the cost saving is instant. And basically the cost saving is that I spare the driver, because I can substitute 2 drivers with 1 self-driving car, at least, maybe 3. Then if their cost is $50,000 per year, then the cost saving is kind of like instant. And this is what we see, that the market is separated. So some of the companies are focusing only on the taxi market. Basically in the US, 7 metropolitan areas cover 70% of the taxi revenues. So they focus on these large cities and that's it. And that's where we will see, I think, the first real-world use case of self-driving cars as a consumer. But in logistical centers, which you don't even see because it's only for the large companies with trucks, there will be these closed solutions where obviously it's not public traffic, it's just internal routing of certain trucks and materials within a closed area.
Great, we're out of time, but let's just check in on that poll that we asked earlier, if we can get that up on the big screen. The question was, in 2030, will there still be human drivers? Okay, the last I saw, the results showed about 75% said yes, there will be, and about 25% said no. So I guess we'll have to wait and see in 12 years. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.